Welcome back to Landvik. Today we're following up on one of the biggest developments in the Houston Wade criminal case so far. And this time, it's not about the underlying allegations, it's about whether the investigation itself was legally conducted. The defense has now filed what could become one of the most significant motions in the entire case, a motion to suppress evidence, or, alternatively, to dismiss the charges altogether. At the center of that motion is a federal law known as the Posse Comitatus Act. For anyone unfamiliar with it, the Posse Comitatus Act generally limits the military's role in civilian law enforcement. The idea behind the law is straightforward. The military is not supposed to function as a civilian police force, except under very specific circumstances authorized by Congress. According to the defense, that's exactly what happened here. Their motion argues that an investigator with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, better known as NCIS, conducted an extended investigation into Houston Wade, who is a civilian. The defense contends that this investigation lasted approximately 87 days, and that civilian law enforcement either was not sufficiently involved or did not direct the investigation in a way that would satisfy the legal limits imposed on military investigative agencies. Based on that argument, the defense is asking the court for two possible remedies. The first is suppression of the evidence. In other words, they want the judge to exclude evidence that they believe was obtained through an investigation that exceeded the military's lawful authority. The second, and much more dramatic request, is outright dismissal of the case, if the court determines that the alleged violation was serious enough to undermine the prosecution. Now, this is where the legal analysis becomes particularly interesting. Even if a court were to conclude that military investigators exceeded the limits imposed by the Posse Comitatus Act, that does not automatically mean the evidence gets thrown out. Federal appellate courts, including the Ninth Circuit, have repeatedly distinguished between finding a statutory violation and deciding what the appropriate remedy should be. Suppression of evidence is considered an extraordinary remedy. Courts generally look for more than simply identifying a technical violation before applying the exclusionary rule. In other words, proving that a violation occurred is only the first hurdle. The defense would still need to convince the court that suppressing evidence, or dismissing the prosecution altogether, is the legally appropriate response. There's another procedural detail that's worth mentioning because it gives some insight into how this motion reached the court. At his last hearing, defense counsel Shannon Polley advised the judge that they intended to file this motion and requested additional time to prepare it. When the expected filing deadline arrived, however, the written motion had not yet been submitted. During that hearing, the judge reportedly remarked that he would sure like to see the motion sometime before the hearing, a comment reflecting the court's expectation that the filing should precede any argument on the issue. The motion has now been filed, allowing the litigation to move forward. So what happens next? The prosecution will file its written response, explaining why it believes the investigation complied with the law, or alternatively, why suppression is not an appropriate remedy even if the court identifies some procedural defect. Depending on whether there are disputed facts, the court may also hold an evidentiary hearing. That hearing could include testimony regarding exactly who directed the investigation, what role NCIS played, how civilian authorities participated, and whether the military's involvement crossed the legal line established by the Posse Comitatus Act and related case law. Ultimately, the judge will have to answer several important questions. Did the investigation violate the Posse Comitatus Act or other legal limitations on military participation in civilian law enforcement? If so, was civilian involvement sufficient to satisfy the law? And perhaps most importantly, if a violation occurred, does that justify suppressing evidence, dismissing the case, or does the prosecution simply continue despite the alleged defect? Those questions could have a significant impact on the future of this case. It's important to emphasize that the court has not yet ruled on the merits of the defense's motion. What we're seeing now is the beginning of what will likely become one of the most consequential legal battles in this prosecution. As the state files its response and the court schedules further hearings, we'll continue following every development, breaking down the legal arguments, separating courtroom filings from courtroom rulings, and explaining what each new step actually means for the case moving forward. If you found this update helpful and you appreciate clear, fact-based analysis without the hype, consider subscribing to the channel. We follow these cases from the filing of a motion all the way through the final ruling, so you'll see every major development as it happens. And more importantly, you'll understand what it actually means. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like. It really does help more people discover the channel and supports the work that goes into researching court records, reviewing filings, and breaking down complex legal issues into plain English. And if you have thoughts on the defense's Posse Comitatus argument, let us know in the comments. Do you think the court will find a violation? And if it does, should that result in suppressed evidence, dismissal of the case, or neither? We'd be interested to hear your perspective. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next case update.